Hey guys, today we are talking about the Second Great Awakening, which hopefully you remember from last year, was that big movement in the United States to change a lot of things. And that word reform right here, that means change. So we're talking about change in the USA. How is it happening? What ideas were people trying to get across? So a couple of vocabulary words first. We've got reform, which means change. And then abolitionist is somebody fighting against slavery. Say that after me. Abolitionist. Yeah, abolitionist. So one of the big people who was fighting against slavery was this lady right here, Harriet Tubman, who was using the Underground Railroad to take slaves to escape slavery. So they would go to the North. So the main idea here is that the Second Great Awakening was really a religious movement. The big idea was that it was religious that led to improvements in slavery. Eventually, slavery was abolished, women's rights, and things like education. So the first idea, when these are the first people on your paper, so you're going to write what they did down in your notes. But the first one is abolitionism. And so you have the North and the South who had very different ideas about slavery. The South needed slavery for agriculture, which was their way of life. And so they thought, even if there's something a little bit negative about slavery, they thought that they needed it to continue their way of life. The North didn't need slavery. And so when they thought it was wrong, they could throw themselves wholeheartedly into it. So look at this cartoon right here. Where do you think this cartoon was made? What do you think this cartoon is trying to say? Make sure you read this caption right here down there. Exactly. They're trying to say, am I not a man and a brother? Is this person not also a human? Is this person not also someone that we should treat equally? And the connotation here when they say brother, that brings people to a religious mindset because the Bible was always talking about being your brother's keeper, being where we are all brothers in under religion, under God, all those kinds of things. They were trying to bring that to mind so people think about religion and Christianity when they think about these issues. So one of the things that really sparked this off was a law called the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act said that people in the North could be taken back to the South to be put back into slavery if they had escaped. But what happened was people would often be kidnapped and brought down to the South to be sold as slaves, even if they hadn't been slaves before. So if you've ever seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, that's what happens to that guy. He gets kidnapped in the North. He wasn't a slave. He had never been a slave, but he is kidnapped and brought down to the South to be a slave. So this law makes it really, really tense between the North and the South. Because the North, they have to put up posters like this where it says, "Caution, colored people of Boston. You're respectfully cautioned to be advised in conversing with the watchmen and police officers because they might kidnap you and bring you to the South." But the people of the South, they wanted their slaves. They wanted to continue slavery, and they didn't want slaves to be escaping to the North. So you had the North and the South who were totally against each other on the issue of slavery. Some of the people that were working against slavery, one of them was Frederick Douglass, who was an escaped slave who became a writer and orator. Orator means someone who's making speeches. So he's famous for his writings and speeches. William Lloyd Garrison was the second one. He fought against slavery by publishing a newspaper, and he also made speeches. So he was an example of what? An orator. Harriet Tubman is the next one on your list. Hopefully you know who Harriet Tubman is. If not, make sure you write down that she helped hundreds of slaves to escape to freedom on the Underground Railroad. This is the same picture we saw at the front. And if you were at the Exhibit B exhibit last week, you saw this same picture of Harriet Tubman helping the slaves escape, spray painted onto the wall. Harriet Beecher Stowe was also really famous, but she's one of the less known people now because people don't read her book as much. Her book was called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it described life under slavery. This is an image of one of the scenes from her book that people read and really it just amazed them that slavery was this bad, and it encouraged people to become abolitionists and encouraged people to want to change their ideas about slavery. And it also made people in the South angry with people in the North because they thought that it portrayed Southern people as bad people. Next one is Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave who didn't escape. He was brought to a free state, and so he asked the Supreme Court for his freedom. The Supreme Court told him that slaves were not citizens, so he had no rights. And this really made Northerners angry because they were thinking about slaves and people who escaped from slavery as people, as brothers, as members of their religion. And so it made them angry, but it made Southerners really happy because the Supreme Court was supporting their way of life. And so that, again, increased the divisions, the tensions between the North and the South. The last one on your list is John Brown. He's one of the most controversial of the figures. He tried to start a slave revolution to fight against plantation owners. Eventually, he was captured and hung by the federal soldiers, but Southern whites really hated him because he was trying to incite slaves to fight against them. But in the North, people thought that he was really someone who had given his life to the cause, and so he was what's called a martyr, someone who gives their life to the cause. To learn more about John Brown, you can watch this video right here at that bit.ly, DTA John Brown. And later on in the Civil War, the Union soldiers sang a song called John Brown's Body. And if you want to listen to the song that they would sing while they were fighting against the South, you can go to this link right here, DTA John Brown song. Second section today is about the suffragists. And so you had suffragists who were fighting. This isn't against slavery. Now we're moving into people who were fighting for a totally different cause, but they were also very much interlinked. Suffragists were fighting for women's rights, and particularly the right to vote. There were also lots of suffragists who were part of another movement called the temperance movement, and that was against alcohol. So that's your second vocabulary word there. The third one is the Declaration of Sentiments, which was the big document that was published for women's rights. And see if you can make the connection between that document and another declaration that we've seen before. Last, the first meeting for women's rights was called the Seneca Falls Convention, and that was really what kicked off the beginning of the suffragist movement in the United States. So back when the suffragist movement was starting in the 1800s, women didn't have the right to vote. Remember, if they were married, then they didn't have the right to control their own money. Their paychecks technically went to their husbands. They weren't allowed to make speeches in public. There were lots and lots of laws that made men and women unequal under the law. And so they wanted to change these things. So they had the Seneca Falls Convention, which is where they met to discuss women's rights, and that was in 1848. And so there at the Seneca Falls Convention, they started these organizations, and they started marches, writings, petitions, public speeches, all those kinds of things that people do to try to get laws changed in our democracy. The first person on your list is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She's the actual author of the Declaration of Sentiments, which was presented at the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. And so that was one of the big documents that organized the women's rights movement, and she is thought of as one of the founding members of the suffragist movement in the U.S. The next one is Lucretia Mott, and she also helped organize the Seneca Falls Convention. And she was also really famous for making these anti-slavery speeches, as well as speeches for women's rights in Philadelphia, trying to get those laws changed. The last one is Susan B. Anthony. She's perhaps the most famous of these suffragists. She was the leader of the women's rights movement. She made her face kind of the forefront of what was going on. But she also linked together the women's rights movements with the movements against alcohol and the movement against slavery. So that's all your facts for today. answer these questions at the end to see if you can get your review complete.